Something unusual happened this week that most people barely noticed, but it revealed just how tense the relationship between Canada and the United States has become. One Canadian member of Parliament quietly boarded a flight to Washington. No official permission, no diplomatic role, no mandate from the government. And within hours, Prime Minister Mark Carney shut it down publicly. Not angrily, not dramatically, but firmly. And that alone should tell you how serious this moment is, because this wasn't really about one politician taking a solo trip. It was about a growing crisis between two countries that once operated like inseparable partners. And it's been building for months. Conservative MP Jivani posted a video announcing he was heading to Washington to help with negotiations. He framed it as patriotic, above party politics, a personal effort to support Canada during a difficult moment. He even mentioned his long-standing relationship with Vice President J.D. Vance, suggesting he could open doors that official channels couldn't. At first glance, it sounded harmless, maybe even helpful. But that's not how international negotiations work. Trade talks aren't run by individual politicians acting independently. They're handled by professional diplomats, trade ministers, and the Prime Minister's office. Jivani isn't Canada's trade critic. He isn't part of the negotiating team. He wasn't authorized to speak for the country. And yet there he was, presenting himself as a back-channel dealmaker. That raised immediate alarms in Ottawa, because when tensions are high, freelance diplomacy isn't brave. It's risky. Right now, Canada is under relentless pressure from Donald Trump. Tariff threats, economic punishment, public attacks on sovereignty, even repeated jokes about Canada becoming the 51st state, and none of it feels like joking anymore. In that environment, unity is everything. One wrong signal can weaken an entire negotiating position. Mark Carney responded quickly, but carefully. He didn't insult Jivani. He didn't accuse him of bad intentions. Instead, he reframed the moment. He suggested the trip was more about media attention than meaningful diplomacy. Then he made something very clear. Canada already has constant high-level contact with American officials. Negotiations are happening through official professional channels. And Jivani simply isn't in a position to conduct foreign policy. Industry Minister Melanie Joly added something even sharper. She pointed out that Jivani represents a riding where General Motors has just cut hundreds of jobs. The Oshawa plant lost its third shift. The Ingersoll plant shut down entirely. Families in his own district were hit directly by Trump's tariffs. And she asked a question that cut straight through the narrative. If this trip was really about helping Canada, was he going to fight for those workers? Was he going to push back against the tariffs that destroyed jobs in his own community? Because that's where the real damage is happening. That's where Canadians are suffering. And suddenly the solo diplomacy looked less like service and more like self-promotion. But here's where the bigger picture comes into focus. This episode didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a much wider pattern in how Trump has been treating Canada. For months now, he's used economic chaos as a weapon. First came threats of massive tariffs if Canada made trade arrangements with China. Even though Canada's deal was narrow and sector-specific, focused on electric vehicles and agricultural exports, Trump framed it as betrayal. He called Mark Carney governor, the same insult he once used against Justin Trudeau. He warned China would devour Canada's economy. Then the pressure escalated. Tariffs jumped to 35%. Industry-specific penalties hit cars, steel, aluminum, lumber, and auto parts, entire sectors that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. And during a White House meeting, Carney told Trump clearly that Canada was not for sale. That annexation was off the table. That sovereignty was non-negotiable. Trump's response? Never say never. Think about that. The President of the United States suggesting that absorbing Canada might one day be possible. This isn't normal diplomacy, this is power politics, and it follows a very specific pattern. Analysts in Washington call it Trump's pressure cycle. He makes extreme threats, creates market panic, dominates headlines, then partially walks things back, sometimes. But even when he retreats, the damage remains. Supply chains freeze, investors hesitate, jobs disappear. Canada is especially vulnerable because the two economies are deeply intertwined. Nearly 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the United States. Factories on both sides of the border depend on each other. Entire industries were built on seamless trade, and Trump knows that, which is why chaos is such an effective weapon. He doesn't need to follow through fully. The threat alone causes disruption. We saw it recently with aircraft certification threats that shook markets despite unclear legal authority. We see it every time a new tariff deadline appears. Confusion first, clarification later, if ever. And this brings us back to Jivani's trip. Because when one side uses instability as strategy, the other side must stay disciplined. Any internal division becomes leverage. Any mixed message becomes opportunity. Carney and Joly understand that. That's why they shut the trip down immediately. Not out of ego, not out of partisanship, but because unity is Canada's strongest defense right now. And there's another layer that makes this even more serious. Canada's military procurement, especially the F-35 fighter jet program, is now tangled in the same political pressure. Ottawa is quietly debating whether continuing deep defense integration with a partner that constantly threatens economic retaliation is still wise, or whether shifting toward European suppliers might provide more independence, even if it angers Washington. This is how far things have shifted. Economic conflict is now influencing military strategy, and while politicians argue and tensions rise, ordinary Canadians are paying the price. Auto workers losing jobs, communities collapsing when plants close, families facing uncertainty because tariffs are being used as weapons. Trump has been clear. He wants cars built in America, steel produced domestically, industries pulled back across the border, and he's willing to punish Canada until that happens. That's the reality behind the headlines. And it's why Melanie Joly's comments hit so hard. This isn't theoretical policy. This is livelihoods being destroyed in real time. Yet this pressure is exactly what makes unauthorized diplomacy tempting. When official talks stall, when economic pain grows, when people feel desperate for solutions, that's when individuals try to bypass institutions, and that's dangerous because it fragments Canada's position. It confuses Washington. It weakens leverage. And according to reports, Jivani had already offered his help through official channels multiple times. Each time, he was turned down. So he went anyway, using his personal connection to the vice president as a workaround, which raises another unanswered question. Who funded the trip? Private donors? Party money? Public funds? No clear explanation has been given, and that lack of transparency only deepens concerns that this was political theater, not diplomacy. But the biggest takeaway is this: the Canada-US relationship Canadians once relied on is changing fast. Disputes are no longer handled quietly through institutions. They're fought publicly, emotionally, through tariffs, threats, and pressure. What used to be a partnership increasingly looks like a power struggle, and that shift is creating the perfect conditions for chaos, division, and risky political moves, which is exactly what Trump's strategy thrives on. What makes this moment so dangerous isn't just one unauthorized trip or one round of tariffs, it's the strategy underneath it all. Because what Donald Trump is doing with Canada isn't random, it's pressure by fragmentation. Instead of negotiating cleanly through institutions, he creates multiple channels of tension at once. Public threats, economic punishment, personal insults, sudden reversals, and then watches how the other side reacts. When unity holds, his leverage weakens. When cracks appear, his leverage multiplies. And the Jivani episode exposed exactly the kind of crack Trump's system is designed to create. One politician acting independently, different messages traveling across borders, unofficial contacts hinting at alternative negotiations. That's how bargaining power slips away. Trump has used this approach before. He did it with NATO allies. He did it with China. He did it with Mexico. Create chaos first, then negotiate from a position where everyone feels desperate for stability, even if the stability never fully comes. And Canada is now in the middle of that storm. Behind closed doors, officials are increasingly treating every Trump threat seriously. Not because they believe all of them will happen, but because even temporary instability is devastating. Factories pause production. Companies delay investments. Markets react instantly. Jobs disappear long before any policy is finalized. This is why the famous phrase circulating in Washington, "Trump always chickens out," is actually misleading. Yes, he often retreats partially, But the damage happens during the threat phase. By the time he softens, the economic harm is already real, and Canada has felt it repeatedly. When trade talks looked promising earlier this year, markets relaxed. Businesses prepared for stability. Then one provincial advertisement quoting Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs set Trump off. He shut down negotiations overnight, added 10% to existing tariffs, refused to meet Mark Carney, publicly mocked Canada again. All over an ad the federal government didn't even produce. That's how fragile the relationship has become. Every moment of progress balanced on the edge of a single provocation. And this instability is why Canada's leadership is being so strict about messaging. Carney has bent where he can, suspending the digital services tax, strengthening border enforcement, boosting defense spending, dropping most retaliatory tariffs, trying to demonstrate good faith, trying to keep doors open. But on core sovereignty issues, he hasn't moved. Canada isn't for sale. Trade policy won't be dictated. Independent relationships won't be banned. And that balance, cooperation without submission, is exactly what makes negotiations so tense. Because Trump's approach isn't about compromise, it's about dominance. Align fully or face pressure. And Canada's refusal to fully align is what's driving the escalation. What's rarely mentioned is how much this trade war is hurting the United States too. During the worst tariff periods, the S&P 500 lost over $4 trillion in value. American manufacturers saw costs spike because Canadian aluminum and steel suddenly became more expensive. Auto companies struggled with disrupted part supplies. Energy markets felt pressure because Canada supplies huge amounts of oil and natural gas to the US. Even tourism collapsed. American travel to Canada dropped 40% in 1 month. That's billions in lost revenue. Airlines, hotels, restaurants, and travel services all took hits, so both countries are bleeding economically. Yet the pressure continues. Deadlines come and go. Deals are hinted at but never finalized. Each time stability appears close, something detonates it. A speech, an ad, a tweet, a new tariff threat. And this cycle is eroding trust at a level that may not be repairable anytime soon. Which brings us back to why freelance diplomacy is so dangerous in this moment. When official channels are already fragile, any unofficial move risks total misinterpretation. Trump's team can claim mixed signals, exploit internal disagreements, pressure one political faction against another, create the illusion of division even when Canada's core position is united. That's why Melanie Joly emphasized so clearly that Canada speaks with one voice internationally, not out of control, out of necessity, because discipline is the only counterweight to chaos. The economic reality makes this even more serious. Canada is the top destination for American exports, over $349 billion in goods in 2024 alone. 14% of all U.S. trade involves Canada. And in reverse, nearly 75% of Canadian exports go south. Energy, cars, machinery, agriculture, manufacturing. The integration is so deep that damage on one side immediately ricochets back to the other, which is why a full-scale trade breakdown would be catastrophic for both economies. But asymmetry still exists. Canada depends more heavily on access to the U.S. market, and Trump knows that. That imbalance is the pressure point. And it explains everything we're seeing. The tariff threats, the public humiliation, the sudden policy shifts, the chaos. It's all leverage. Yet there's a twist many Americans are starting to notice. This strategy is pushing allies to quietly rethink dependence. Canada is already diversifying trade relationships. Europe is accelerating agreements with India and Asia. Even long-standing partners are hedging against unpredictability, because reliability matters more than raw market size in the long run. And when unpredictability becomes constant, diversification becomes survival. This is what Mark Carney meant when he spoke of rupture instead of transition. The old rules-based order isn't slowly evolving. It's cracking under pressure. And economic coercion is speeding that fracture up. Now the future of North American cooperation sits on a knife's edge. If negotiations stabilize, the damage might be contained. If pressure continues, industries will permanently restructure supply chains. Factories will relocate. Investment will shift. And once that happens, integration won't easily return. Companies don't rebuild cross-border systems twice. They adapt once and move on, which means this moment isn't just about tariffs. It's about whether decades of economic partnership survive, or whether North America quietly fragments into competing blocs. And the frightening truth is that fragmentation has already begun. Every threat accelerates it. Every crisis deepens it. Every breakdown in trust pushes businesses to seek safer ground elsewhere. So when a single MP boards a flight without authorization, it may seem like a small political stunt. But in this climate, small moves carry massive consequences. They hint at division, invite exploitation, and weaken the only thing protecting Canada right now, a unified negotiating front. This isn't about silencing voices. It's about survival in an economic power struggle. And as long as chaos remains the main negotiating tool coming from Washington, discipline will remain Canada's only shield. The question now isn't whether tensions will ease, it's whether the damage already done can still be reversed, or whether this is the beginning of a permanent shift in how North America trades, cooperates, and competes. Because once trust breaks at this scale, rebuilding it takes generations, not elections. And that's the real story unfolding beneath the headlines. If you want to keep understanding how global politics is reshaping everyday lives in ways most media never explain, stay with me. Follow, share, and keep the conversation going. Because what happens next won't just affect Canada and the United States. It will reshape how power, trade, and alliances work across the world.